Ladies and gentlemen, what if I told you that the foundation upon which our entire regulatory framework for radiofrequency radiation exposure is built is not merely flawed but scientifically bankrupt, rooted in 19th century thermodynamic equations that predate our understanding of DNA, cellular bioelectromagnetics, and even the fundamental principles of molecular biology? What if I told you that the so-called safety standards we have today were not merely established in error, but were engineered with malicious intent, a deliberate, premeditated fraud designed to serve corporate hegemony over scientific integrity? To truly grasp the colossal magnitude of this deception, one must begin by understanding how regulatory capture functions at the highest levels of policy formation, and how 1996 marked the most consequential coup in modern scientific and legal history. An engineered regulatory insurrection that ensured no challenge to wireless proliferation could ever be mounted on the grounds of public health. The 1889 fallacy: how 19th century physics hijacked 21st century biology. The FCC's RF exposure guidelines, established in 1996, are not simply outdated. They were never legitimate to begin with. The entire framework is predicated on a singularly myopic assumption derived from the Arrhenius equation, 1889, a thermodynamic model that posits that biological harm can only occur via thermal effects. This presupposition is catastrophically antiquated and unequivocally scientifically indefensible for the following reasons. Biological nonlinearity. The dose-response relationship of electromagnetic exposure does not adhere to classical thermodynamic principles. Empirical evidence demonstrates that lower intensity exposures can elicit disproportionately greater biological effects, a phenomenon observed in the National Toxicology Program Study, 2018, which found that lower SR levels produced higher rates of cancer than higher SR levels. Non-thermal bioeffects. Biological systems do not merely respond to thermal gradients. They exhibit complex, frequency-dependent bioelectromagnetic interactions. Calcium ion channel disruption, oxidative stress, and DNA strand breaks occur at power densities far below those required for thermal induction. Henry Lie's research in 1995 conclusively demonstrated DNA fragmentation at non-thermal exposure levels, an effect the industry sought to suppress through coordinated character assassination, as revealed in the notorious wargaming memo. Chronobiological disruptions. The circadian rhythm, melatonin production, and neuroendocrine homeostasis are all modulated by subtle electromagnetic fields. Longitudinal studies have documented neurological and reproductive consequences from chronic exposure at subthermal levels. Thus, to predicate regulatory frameworks on the assumption that heating is the sole determinant of biological harm is not merely incorrect, it is fraudulent. The 1996 regulatory coup: how science was dismantled to serve industry interests. In 1996, the Telecommunications Act was passed, and with it, Section 704, which prohibited local governments from restricting cell tower installations based on health concerns. This was not an accident. It was a strategic maneuver that ensured total regulatory capture. The FCC, an agency with zero biomedical expertise, was handed exclusive authority over RF safety, while the EPA's RF Research Division was systematically defunded. This meant that scientific oversight was eliminated, and the only agency left to regulate exposure limits was the very agency tasked with expanding wireless deployment. Judicial nullification of public dissent. By legislatively barring health-based objections, the industry effectively preempted all legal challenges, rendering the First and 10th Amendments inoperable in matters of RF exposure. Industry imposed silence on scientific dissent. the suppression of the National Toxicology Program's findings, which provided clear evidence of carcinogenicity, was in direct violation of Public Law 90-602, which mandates ongoing study of radiation-emitting devices. The telecommunications sector exerts an influence over regulatory bodies unparalleled in modern industry, exceeding even the historical influence of big tobacco. Thus, we are not dealing with mere negligence. We are dealing with a coordinated conspiracy to obfuscate risk, silence scientific inquiry, and engineer public compliance through regulatory and legal mechanisms designed to preclude accountability. The consequences: a public health emergency of unprecedented scale. The ramifications of this deception are now manifesting as a global epidemiological crisis. Carcinogenesis and genomic instability. Brain tumors, acoustic neuromas, and gliomas have been observed disproportionately in individuals with high cumulative RF exposure. The Interphone study from 2010, the Hardell Group studies spanning 2003 to 2013, and the Bio-Initiative report from 2012 all confirm an elevated risk of malignancy. Yet the industry continues to cite flawed epidemiological models to manufacture doubt. Neurodevelopmental disorders and cognitive impairment. The rise of ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, and neurodegenerative conditions correlates disturbingly with the rapid proliferation of RF-emitting devices. Oxidative stress and calcium channel dysregulation are well documented in neurobiological pathology, yet are conspicuously absent from regulatory discourse. Fertility and endocrine disruption. Studies on sperm viability and ovarian reserve indicate that RF exposure detrimentally impacts reproductive health, yet regulatory bodies remain silent. The path forward: the only viable scientific and policy solutions. Total revocation of the FCC's RF guidelines. These standards must be replaced with biologically based exposure limits that account for oxidative stress, DNA damage, and nonlinear dose-response relationships. Repeal of Section 704. The public's right to challenge infrastructure placement based on health concerns must be reinstated. The constitutional violations embedded within the Telecom Act must be judicially reviewed. Mandated transition to Wi-Fi, fiber optics, and space-based broadband. RF-based infrastructure must be phased out in favor of safer, more efficient alternatives. The implementation of Wi-Fi in schools, workplaces, and hospitals would significantly reduce exposure without compromising connectivity. Reinstatement of Public Law 90-602. Federal funding for independent bioelectromagnetic research must be restored and shielded from industry influence. Categorical reclassification of RF radiation as a carcinogen. Given the compelling epidemiological and mechanistic data, RF exposure should be reclassified as a Class 1 carcinogen by the IIRC. Final thought: a call for intellectual and scientific integrity. The era of deceptive industry narratives, regulatory collusion, and scientific censorship must end. The preservation of biological integrity, public health, and scientific truth demands that we dismantle this fraudulent edifice, and that we do so immediately. The question is no longer whether RF radiation poses a risk. The question is, how long will we allow the deception to continue? We are at an inflection point in human history. We can either allow industry-engineered pseudoscience to dictate public policy, or we can demand empirical rigor, scientific honesty, and ethical governance. The time for ambiguity has passed. The truth is undeniable, and now it is our collective responsibility to act upon it. Visit RF Safe to learn more.